Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering the trails out west, the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail. Between the years of 1840 and 1860, Americans wanted to fulfill their manifest destiny, the God-given obvious fate of Americans settling from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Originally, the first travelers to head out west were fur trappers and explorers who would live among and trade with the Native Americans of the plains and of the northwest part of the United States. These mountain men, as they were called, believed that the trail out west was considered too rough for women and children. But manifest destiny led American settlers to want to settle in the Northwest territories like Oregon and California, and the Southwest territories like New Mexico. In 1836, a small group of pioneers and wagons set out to minister the Cayuse Indians of the Walla Walla Valley. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman led this wagon train. Narcissa's name became well known, and many other women eventually decided to try the trip. In 1843, Marcus Whitman led about 1,000 pioneers along the Oregon Trail. So the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail were the main highways to the west that would lead explorers to the Pacific Ocean. Deep ruts were made in the ground that travelers would follow night and day for months. The Oregon Trail was the main route for settlers who wanted to travel across the Great Plains of the United States and the Continental Divide to the Willamette Valley of Oregon or the gold fields of California. The Santa Fe Trail, on the other hand, was the main route to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The trail was over 2,000 miles long. Long wagon trains left from Independence, Missouri, and more than 500,000 people traveled the trails during these 20-year time. The Oregon Trail wasn't exactly one specific route. The majority of the settlers and explorers traveled in a covered wagon called a prairie schooner. Now, a schooner is a type of sailing vessel, and the canvas that covers the wagon resembled the sail on the schooner, giving the wagon its name. These wagons were made of wood, with wooden axles and wooden tongues, and most times were about 4 feet wide by about 8 to 10 feet long. They also weighed around 1,300 pounds. The axles of the wagon were made to only support around 2,000 pounds, which included the goods and the people inside. Since the axles were made from wood and there were really no springs to cushion the rough and bumpy terrain of the Midwestern states, most of the people walked alongside the wagon rather than riding in it. Now remember, this was over a 2,000-mile ride, so mostly the elderly, the very young, the injured, pregnant women, they would be the ones riding inside the wagons for some periods of time. So because of the heavy load, pulling the wagons were normally oxen or mules. The heavier weights of the wagons and the mules made for a long, slow day. On the average, settlers would travel around 2 miles per hour and would travel only about 15 to 20 miles a day. The topography of the land out west, because it included mountains, rivers, and deserts that the travelers needed to cross to make it to Oregon or California, made these trips very, very long. The Oregon Trail and Santa Fe Trail, like I said, started in Independence, Missouri. That was one of the most western cities in the state of Missouri. Many of the general stores or trading posts were located in this area because travelers would purchase many of their goods here and wagon trains would be assembled here. Store owners would typically convince the travelers to purchase more food and supplies than what they typically needed due to unforeseen circumstances. Since travelers usually had an abundance of supplies, many broken pieces of wagons, personal possessions, and supplies were left strewn all over the trail. There was no fine for littering in the mid-1800s, so you can imagine how bad it was. In Wyoming, there still stands an important fort named Fort Laramie. It is in the middle of nowhere. I've been there before. The picture that's on my website is from there. So you could see that it's in the middle of nowhere. So I can imagine what it was like in the 1840s and 1860s. There must have just been nothing around. Fort Laramie was established in the 1830s as a fur trading post and was a safe place for weary travelers to rest their heads and resupply if needed. It would become the largest and best known military post in the plains. The fort became famous for accumulating large amounts of trash and supplies dumped outside its gates. Now, many books and movies omit this type of information. Also, some movies portray the natives as being ruthless killers that fed on the killing of white settlers. Remember that for centuries, settlers called natives savages, so this was no surprise to dramatize this information. However, for the thousands of wagon trains and hundreds of thousands of people, only roughly 400 people were recorded as being killed by Native Americans. Many of the tribes were peaceful and actually aided the weary travelers. Many more travelers, about 20,000 of them, perished from diseases like cholera and dysentery. Other reasons for these traveler deaths were things like starvation, animal attacks, drowning, snake bites, and infections. It wasn't until after the beginning of the Civil War that Native American attacks would increase in these numbers. We know how many travelers and names and dates that traveled to the Western Territories because of a natural landmark in Wyoming called Independence Rock. It is given the name the Register of the Desert because as weary travelers passed the large granite stone, they would carve their names and dates into the rock that can still be seen today. The vast number of people that traveled out west made 3 or 4 destinations their primary target. 80,000 travelers made Oregon their destination. 70,000 Mormons traveled south to make Utah their destination, while the vast majority, around 250,000, made their way to California to take their chances in the gold fields. Large portions of today's population can trace their lineage back to these travelers who braved the elements and took this 4 to 5 month long journey on the Oregon Trail to complete our manifest destiny. I'll see you next time.